All right, welcome everybody. I want to welcome Jason Miller, Associate Professor of Supply Chain at the Eli Broad College of Business at Michigan State. Welcome, Jason. You're our guest advisor today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on, Jared.
Absolutely. Man, I'm so excited to talk to you. We kind of had a brief discussion before our call here. Talked about a lot of really great things. One of the things that I'm excited about, and I'll let you introduce yourself in a second, but for freight professionals, especially those in leadership positions or those trying to understand, the freight environment, maybe they're new to the industry or business, is what to make sense, how to make sense of all the data that's incoming, how to make sense of what the market's doing, so they can make, maybe insightful decisions or understand a little bit better about how their businesses will be impacted in the future. So you have a lot of really great content and a lot of great insight to what's going on. So I'm excited to talk to you. But take a minute, if you can, just kind of maybe introduce yourself and what you do and what your specialty is.
Yeah, so in the Broad College of Business, so I teach the capstone undergraduate supply chain course, which is a case-based, discussion-based course, procurement, ops, and logistics, about 10 case studies covering all those areas. I also teach in our PhD program. And then from a research standpoint, I primarily focus on the transportation space. My main emphasis has been the motor carrier sector. Kind of started my career dealing with safety related issues, have since broadened that out to look a little bit more on regulatory things like what's the effect of the ELD mandate, and then also market dynamics. How does change in spot price affect contract price? What factors affect new heavy truck orders? So taking sort of an economist perspective at topics that are very focused on the trucking sector.
Awesome. I love it. So we'll nerd out a little bit. Obviously, I'm not an economist, but hopefully we can get some insights for people, who again just kind of want to understand what they're looking at. As I talk to a lot of people, maybe this is completely a noob idea of mine, but perhaps you can maybe calm my senses down to people who I talk to, especially am I going crazy? Or are the numbers that we're seeing, as indices come out and talk about what's going on in the economy in general, it feels like it's all over the place. Is that because I'm uninformed, or is it really just kind of, is it so complex or just kind of muddled right now? We just don't quite know what to make of what's happening.
I don't feel bad. We're all in that position right now. I think the thing to recognize is we've never had an economic shock that has hit us like the COVID-19 pandemic has. When you look at any of the major statistics, they're showing changes that we've just never seen before. And the one thing we've consistently found from a lot of studies in economics is during recessionary periods, the amount of disagreement between professionals we disagree a lot more. So if you look, for example, there's a survey of professional forecasters the Philadelphia Federal Reserve does. During normal times, folks pretty much agree on, hey, this is going to be what GDP growth is 2 quarters from now. This time, if you look at the most recent survey, predictions are ranging from we'll be in contraction 2 quarters now to we'll have a annualized GDP growth of 10%. So, I mean, It's literally from continued recession to best quarter we've ever seen on a quarter over quarter comparison.
Right.
So professionals disagree more when uncertainty is high. So don't feel bad.
Okay. Well, that's good. It makes me feel better. I like to be informed, but again, for those not used to looking at all the data and the things that are coming in, it could be a little overwhelming. And again, if you don't have all the kind of the tools necessary to understand that stuff, again, you just kind of get lost in it sometimes. You had mentioned a little bit about some of the surveys that were coming out, and this is one of the things that you had shared. And I'm going to share my screen here that perhaps can maybe start us off a little bit, because there's a lot of, it seems to be consensus being currently talked about regarding what is the economy, what does a recovery look like, or what are the kind of the outlooks of what's going on. And you had posted this before. This was a survey of economists that you were talking about regarding different ideas of what the recovery looks like. And it seems to me, and you can maybe explain this a little bit more, get some more insight, but it seems to me that there's an idea perhaps that we may not see except for kind of a slow momentum upward, any kind of radical either dip or increase in the recovery itself. Does that make sense? And am I kind of getting that right a little bit?
Yeah, so I think so. 538, which if you don't follow that website, I highly encourage you to do.
I
There's some of the
agree.
best
Yeah, it's
data
great.
scientists there are out there. I mean, they do everything. I mean, their sports stuff is what I personally love the most because I'm a baseball junkie
Right.
on the side in my limited spare time. But so they've done a survey of economists, and one thing, and they were asking, what do you think this recovery is going to look like? And as time has been going on, you've probably been hearing a lot of things like V shapes, U shapes, W shapes, L shapes. Well, and the one that we seem to be settling on is this idea. They call it the reverse radical, kind of a playoff of what a radical symbol looks like for like a square root.
Right.
And basically, the idea is we had a very sharp contraction. We're seeing a fairly rapid recovery right now, but we're not going to recover to pre-COVID levels. And
Yeah.
the logic for that is the fact that we're not going to see the hotel sector
Hmm.
come back as much. We're not going to see air travel come back as much. We're not going to see dine-in restaurants or nightclubs and things like that. And so essentially the idea is that we are going to have some sectors of the economy that basically are not going to be able to come back anywhere near the level they were at before until we have a effective vaccine.
Yeah. Yeah. And that makes complete sense. And I think what resonates with me with kind of that, those different types of recovery models is that it puts in perspective that, without a consensus on what exactly is happening with unemployment, how people will interact in this kind of new post-COVID, world, like you talked about. How do people travel? How do people spend money outside of their home? Those are all things that absolutely contribute to not only the economy itself, but especially directly to freight.
No, exactly. And I think the one thing we're having a challenge understanding right now, and why you'll see so much debate about where freight volume's going, is I think one school of thought is saying what people are doing is they're taking, their discretionary income that they maybe were going to go spend on a vacation. And rather than buying that experience, I'm going to spruce up my house. I'm going to put on a new deck. I'm going to do these projects.
Yeah.
From a freight standpoint, that transition is actually good because it's to more physical product.
Hmm.
Sort of the other school of thought that I'm a little bit more, I'd say, a part of is that still have very high unemployment numbers. And there's a concern that once we see extended unemployment, or I should say expanded unemployment running out, which will happen here in about a month, and we're already having states talking about furloughing individuals because of budget crises, we're seeing capital investment is going to be very much down.
Yeah.
And now that we're starting to see some of the, yesterday we just set a record for most confirmed COVID cases in the United States.
Yeah.
I'm going to emphasize confirmed. I think we'd all agree probably in March and April we had far more. We just didn't have the testing.
No testing, right? Yeah.
But as we see those confirmed cases continue to go up, how does that affect the consumer psyche? I mean, we just saw, this morning, Texas actually rolling back their reopening. And so that's going to put more people unemployed. And so the question becomes, if you're more in that school of thought, is how much longer is essentially a retail driven recovery, which is what we're seeing at the moment. How sustainable is that?
Yeah. Well, something you brought up, I think is important, maybe in perspective at least, is some of the consumer spending has to be driven, at least in part, by the additional, the PPP, benefits, as well as the all the unemployment benefits that are currently available that run out at the end of July. And so it seems, that comfort level that comes with that, that additional, income makes retail, spending easier. But once I think you start to feel the contraction of that a little bit, and you start people, worried about, hey, well, I don't have a job yet. All this extra money, perhaps is running out. You might see, even further contraction, maybe even a sharper contraction based on some of that spending as people start to, maybe save their money a little bit more, or really pull back on spending in general.
No, exactly. And I even think about what I myself did when I had to essentially set up a home office to teach my classes. I
Mm-hmm.
ended up going out. I had my non-work computer that I had was 5 years old. So Dell's running a great deal. I'm going to buy a computer. I'm going to
Yeah.
buy a new printer. I know a tremendous number of my colleagues were going through the same thing. So there's a surge in essentially one-time purchases. My uncle's a judge in Northwest Ohio, and he was telling me he's got a beautiful pond in his backyard, and he was in at a local store that focuses on pond supplies and fish. And the gentleman that owned that store said he had the best spring he's ever had
Yeah.
because many individuals are bringing in their stimulus checks and they were stocking their pond. They were
Oh,
buying
yeah.
more pontoons. They were expanding their docks because they were expecting to spend a lot more time at their house, at home.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sitting here thinking in my mind going, okay, that definitely means in certain sectors we've seen a lot of freight move, but these are one-time purchases. These are not something that's going to be on an ongoing basis. And so it's hard to tell
Yeah.
whether we're seeing a sustained gain versus this is sort of a one-time blip.
Right. I want to share something else that you had posted. I thought was would be relevant to what we're talking about here. If I can get to the right slide real quick here. So we talked about unemployment. Number one, this is the most recent data that you had submitted, but I thought was, again, it was kind of the most recent data about what the unemployment looks like. And so for, again, leaders in our space, or people who are working in the freight industry, this seems to have, I think, a potentially big impact because, relative to unemployment, obviously, if people don't have jobs, they don't spend. The capital isn't there for them to spend like they would, of course, if the nation is working. And so, you've articulated here with this sheet here about, luckily, the continued claims, or unluckily, the continued claims themselves have continued pretty steady. We've seen a little bit of a decrease, but not a lot. Initial claims have gone down, but talk about what that means in an economic cycle, and again how that might impact, specifically to not only the economy itself, but to directly to freight.
Yeah, happy to. So looking at this plot here, so I've got the initial claim. So this is reported every week on Thursday morning at 8:30. So if you check in like CNBC at about 8:31, they'll have the numbers, or you can just throw it on Google, and you'll get the Bureau of Labor Statistics document. So every Thursday at 8:30, we get the weekly unemployment data.
Yeah.
So initial claims have been going down. So they peaked. It would have been the week ending March 28th, where we had about almost 7 million. And to put this in perspective, prior to this pandemic, the worst number we ever had on a raw number basis was in 1982, where it was 692,000. Now, when you adjust for the change in the population, that number would be in the millions as well. So we have to keep that in perspective. But these numbers, even the last week, the release from this Thursday for the week ending 6/20 is still a catastrophic 1.48 million initial claims. And what we've seen is while claims have been going down, originally at the start, they were going down fairly rapidly. Like the next week was about 85% of what the prior week was. And that'll get you down towards a sort of the original level fairly quickly in the space of about 10 to 12 weeks. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that percentage decline has started to slow. And so, as an example, the last week's data was 96% of what the prior week data was.
Right.
And so, if we're going to start seeing that slow, it's suggesting that the unemployment claims are not going down as fast as what we were thinking at first. So the key concern there is this is more people filing than we expected. That's going to have an effect on consumer buying power as we move forward. The continued claims, which are really, in my mind, the even more important metric to watch, because this is individuals who have been on unemployment for 2 or more weeks in a row. That number, while it peaked about 25 million and we just fell below 20 million, we're still at over 19 million individuals have been unemployed for 2 or more weeks. This is the number to me, if you really want to look at how a recession is ending, as we start coming out, truly coming out of a recession, this number should very rapidly start to tick down.
Hmm.
And so my concern from a long-term freight recovery standpoint is I do not see how we have robust freight demand if we have 19 million, 18 million, 15 million Americans on unemployment, because you can see looking at this chart, the number of individuals on continued claims is far, 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 far below that. I believe looking at this chart, the number is usually around 2 million in comparison. So we're at over 9 times our typical value.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I piggyback on that, how I think how important that is to the overall picture of what, the next few months will look like is, if those continued claims, continue to be kind of be plateaued at that level, that indicates that there's not this robust recovery happening. And of course, from an industry perspective, if people aren't there making the product, right, it's not going to be shipped. If people aren't working, right, they're not working at those places that are producing, all the things that are, inputs for durable goods or whatever it may be. It's just not being produced itself, so it can't be shipped.
No, exactly. And what my biggest concern and what the idea of this reverse radical recovery would be is, unfortunately, we're not going to see that number be able to get back to where it was previously, because we're going to have, essentially, COVID is going to create a structural barrier that keeps certain industries from rebounding. So I think a good example is going to be individuals who work at bars and nightclubs. I cannot fathom how we are going to have bars and nightclubs until we have a vaccine. I mean, again, we've seen what's happened in states that have opened up and allowed for large crowded indoor gatherings, and we've seen tremendous spikes in confirmed cases.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, that's going to affect tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals who you are basically putting on a permanent unemployment unless they can find a job in a different industry.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're going to see it firsthand, right? Being at a university level with so many people engaged in kind of a, very confined space, you're going to see kind of the immediate impact of what COVID is going to look like kind of in maybe a future wave.
Yes, we're taking as many precautions here at Michigan State. We've got several teams around campus that are working on this. We have social distance protocols, plans in place, but we are bringing the students back in the fall. And I would be lying if I say we're not worried about it. We're obviously very, very, very concerned about it, but we also recognize that, we have to find a way to deliver as good of an education as we possibly can. And unfortunately, the online, medium is not the optimal way to deliver certain content, especially upper level content like I teach.
Yeah, and that's a good point. So all the kind of inputs that you take, right? All the metrics, obviously they're derived from somewhere. What is your recommendation for those looking to understand the markets a little bit more? What kind of indices do you look at? What are some of the sources you go to find relevant data that helps you kind of coalesce in your mind what's going on?
Okay, so I'm going to start with sort of the free data because I think that's what we all like.
Yeah.
So I look, if I'm looking at freight volume, so I'm just going to start, or I'm just going to say I'm worried about trucking, not even volumes, just trucking. If you need pricing data, Cass Freight Systems every month, I believe Stifel now calculates it. They put out the Cass Truckload Line Haul Index. That's a very good measure of line haul rates, primarily for contract freight, because that's data from typically big shippers to big carriers. And so that's mostly going to be contract. Bureau of Labor Statistics every month puts out a producer price index for both the full truckload and the less than truckload sector. So they actually have separate indices. Those are collected every month through the BLS's systematic surveying of companies in essentially every industry that you can imagine. So for contract pricing data, those are my go-tos. You can get any data from Bureau of Labor Statistics. One database I'd encourage everybody, if you're getting into this, is the FRED database, FRED. It's maintained by the St. Louis Federal Reserve. It is about 750,000 time series of data. And so it's your best source for that. So you can just type in truckload producer price index and it'll show up for you.
Yeah.
For
I'll make sure to put
shipment,
some of those notes from some of those what you're just currently mentioning. I'll put them in the notes there for people to look at.
So for pricing for contracts, that's what I look at. If I'm looking for spot pricing, DAT is kind of my go-to for that. They provide weekly updates that are outstanding. So I would just encourage you to go DAT's website or follow them on LinkedIn. They're putting out information all the time. With regard to volumes, I track several different things. So CAS has a cash shipments index. That's kind of a combination of truck and rail. It's sort of all-inclusive. One thing I'd encourage people, if you use that, is you do need to seasonally adjust that series if you want to look at month-over-month comparisons, because that data has a substantial degree of seasonality. American Trucking Associations puts out a index each month of trucking activity from their survey, so they're doing an approach very similar to Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then I also track FreightWaves outbound tender volume index data. So the one thing I would always encourage folks is look at multiple indices, because they're going to be taken from a different sample. They're going to be collected differently. And typically, if you combine all of it together, you get a little bit better of a picture of reality than you would otherwise. Yeah. I say that especially with data from industry sources, because the advantage the government has, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they see every trucking company in the United States because they can look at the unemployment filings data. And even if it's a trucking company with 2 drivers, you still have to pay unemployment insurance somewhere to, let's say, a dispatcher. So they can systematically survey firms. They have, and the annual survey manufacturers or the census manufacturers, you're legally required to fill it out. So government data, I always give kind of that's the gold standard. And then with industry data, the best thing you can do is get multiple sources of data, because you're typically capturing a different slice of the population, or you may be measuring something a little differently. Yeah. And ideally, they triangulate and they tell you a different story, versus if they're telling you something a little different, you try to go in and say, okay, well, what possibly could explain that?
Yeah. And I always like to, to point out that there seems to be a huge influx of commercial data, commercialization of data. Everybody has an index. Everybody has, some metric or something that they put together. A lot of it is great data. Obviously, it's important. It paints a picture. It tells something. But I always like to say is invest in the time, I think, to look at you go to the source, right? Look at the primary sources that says, hey, this is where the data that those commercial products are pulling from in order to, articulate whatever they're trying to, to tell you. But again, understand the sources of the data you're getting to. And again, sometimes they're skewed, certain ways. There's obviously data models that are skewed based on the type of a business that they bring in. There's always been a kind of a discussion within the industry between some of the the broker boards or the load boards that are out there, and of course some of those places have have indexes they put out or information they put out, data that they put out. But again, understanding what kind of data they're pulling from, what makes up kind of the components of that data. Unless I'm wrong, unless you could point out that where I'm wrong on that, but it seems like some of that data is skewed by the data that they have collected, and that's oftentimes shaded by the types of businesses they're doing, they're getting those inputs from, I guess.
No, you're exactly right. And so I think the thing you always have to, my statement is always even if you have a very non-random sample, as long as your non-random sample is behaving the way the whole population is, then it's not really a concern. Where you can run into things. So, and I think COVID has highlighted as a good example, the dichotomy of how large firms versus small firms have been able to respond to this crisis. For example, take retail. A lot of large firms have been able to, for example, your Walmarts, your Home Depots, your Costcos, have been able to weather this very well, if not show actually record sales.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, let's say your small mom and pop furniture store has been very, very, very badly hit by this because they have been forced to shut down because they're not an essential service.
Right.
So the one thing I always say is these macro level indices may not be reflective of what any individual company is experiencing. And so you always have to, first go and look what is local to you. And by local, I mean, what data is most specific to you? And then you start asking yourself, okay, am I serving customers whose freight is representative of the industry? Or is there some more micro level index that I need to look at?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the key thing is always starting with your own data. And then for the general industry trends, take a look at these broader series. But then again, recognize, how are they measured? We always call it from when we measure things, what's the response process that's generating this data? What is their sample? Typically, there is a trade-off in that the more high frequency the data is you get, it may not be as representative as some of the lower frequency data, because typically high frequency data is going to be being fed in electronically somehow. It's the only way we get a daily data.
Mm-hmm.
Versus, if you can do a survey once a month. A good example of this is how we calculate the consumer price index for inflation, is that's done by surveying retail establishments and a whole bunch of other establishments to calculate this basket of prices. You also have Nielsen that has scanner panel data from every one of the large retailers. Nielsen's data is much more high frequency, but it will miss your small mom and pop grocery store in a small town like where I grew up, where the grocery store still to this day does not have barcoding because they don't need it. They don't have that many products.
Yeah.
And so there's usually a trade-off between high frequency usually means bigger players and versus maybe lower frequency data where if you can systematically survey it, it may be a little bit of a better general representation.
Yeah. I want to maybe put that into perspective with another slide that you had offered regarding some of the indexes and what that looks like in terms of volumes. Hopefully you can see that right now. But this trucking volumes comparison that you have, I think this is an important I guess illustration of what you're talking about, right? In terms of inputs into the data itself, you have a couple different metrics or indices here involved to kind of create a picture. Maybe walk us through because this is something you put out often that I think is directionally super important. Maybe you could walk us through, what this says.
Yeah, so exactly. So I think this is a good example just to this point we're talking. So the one thing that I guess I look for as an academic is I look for discrepancies in data. And one discrepancy that for me I noticed was that the outbound tender volume index that FreightWaves publishes was showing a very robust recovery of freight, whereas American Trucking Association's data was not. And this was particularly apparent with the recent May release, where ATA was showing activity was down about 10% year over year. But FreightWaves data is showing activities up 1% year over year. That's enough of a discrepancy that in my mind, I ask, okay, can something explain that? And so what I did here is I plotted in black, it's the year over year change on a percent basis of FreightWaves OTVI metric. And then in red, I've got year over year percent change in the ATA's truck tonnage metric. And sort of the discrepancy that you can see takes place right around the COVID period, right? The changes don't look that pronounced different until we get to March. And then we see in March, OTVI jumps 16% year over year, but truck tonnage doesn't move. Then we see both go down substantially for April. ATAs more so than freight waves. But then we see this very big divergence, and that ATA still goes down further, but OTVI actually goes up. And so got me thinking, well, could this be the fact that the larger entities are more likely to be essential businesses, and they also tend to be focused a little bit more on the consumer side? So what I did is I built from the census data a retail index that combined data from 4 sectors. And I apologize that these names are going to sound really stupid, but don't blame me, blame the Census Bureau on this one. But it's the building material and garden equipment, so Home Depot,
Right.
general merchandise, so Walmart, food and beverage stores, so Kroger, and then non-store retail, which would be like Etsy, Amazon, Lands End, any catalog retailer, QVC or whatnot. I took all their data, combined it together to create a retail index, and again, plotted this year over year. And then lastly, I took the Census Bureau's Industrial Production Index, which is an index that takes into consideration all manufacturing, all mining, and all electrical utility production. So it's like the big all-inclusive industrial index. And I plotted these out, and sure enough, what stood out to me, as you can see in green with the retail, the green line and the black line move together a lot. Mm-hmm. We can see that when those sectors saw a huge jump in March retail because people stocked up, the hoarding that took place on toilet paper and meat and all of these things. Well, that very much showed up in the census data, and it also showed up in OTVI, but it didn't show up really at all in the ATA's data. Mm-hmm. In contrast, then we can see in, let's say, in May, we see that retail was again up. It was up almost 15, 16% year over year. We see that OTVI is actually up year over year, but we can see ATA's measure is down, whereas industrial production is really down. So the thing that this is jumping out to me is saying, okay, OTVI is clearly more retail centric than what the ATA's tonnage metric is. And that isn't a bad thing. That's just the fact that you've got different methodologies capturing different pieces of information. And so what that would be telling me is, if I'm a large carrier and if I have a lot of exposure to the consumer retail sector, OTVI is probably very, very representative for me. On the other hand, if I'm a small carrier, let's say I'm a flatbed carrier, I primarily focus on hauling industrial equipment, OTVI is probably not going to be that representative for me.
Yeah.
And so this is just, again, illustrating one specific index may not apply to you. But it's good that if, as a decision maker, that you can sort of understand what other things do these indices correlate with, because you can then start getting a sense, since freight's derived demand, what really is affecting this. Similarly, as an example, CAS's data on shipments very strongly behaves like the industrial production data. And so that's suggesting, okay, CAS is probably processing invoices for shippers who are more industrial in nature versus consumer. So it's just good that, if you're going to use an index to make decisions or inform your strategy, understand what that is really capturing, because in many cases you really can't see how was this index calculated in the first place.
Right. Yeah. So I think from a tactical perspective, what you've said is, for people making decisions, trying to understand, future moves, preparing, planning for, future state. Obviously, depending on what your business makeup is, if you're going off of OBTI, again, like you talked about, and if you're a flatbed carrier, or you're not primarily, hauling, retail goods, that may not be reflective of the type of business that you're in. And so this is where data, I think, could be extremely useful. And obviously having people like you help interpret the data is important for folks who, again, look at something and may not understand exactly what it's telling you. But it can provide directional data specific to the parts of business that you're into. But I think it takes, from an operational level, a really understanding of who you are as a company. But if you're on any one of those, if you're on DAT or freight waves or whatever it may be, and you're looking at something that's irrelevant to your business, if you're a tanker, a truck, or you're primarily hauling, food from a meat packing, plant, you're doing protein business, some of this data will not be relevant to you. And so, not necessarily, maybe not buyer beware, but invest the time and understand again how it is relevant to you.
Yeah, no, exactly. There's a really, and it's freely available. There's an interesting thesis that a gentleman named Big Nell who got his degree from MIT did in 2013, where he was looking at, for example, spot pricing for this specific shipper,
Mm-hmm.
and he was comparing it to all these different indices. And what he actually found for that specific shipper was there was no index available that really correlated with this, because the spot price this shipper paid, there was a certain type of seasonality which doesn't show up in the aggregated data. And so essentially the conclusion is we can't really use an aggregate index for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That may be the situation you find yourself in. And so that's where I think, again, as a decision maker, it's wonderful if you have these indices available and your business moves like that. But if you do not, then obviously you need to be cautious about, what you're doing. So, it's always good to double check and make sure that the data is reflective of your specific situation.
Right. I always get worried when data comes out and things get posted and people start talking about, well, there's a V-shaped recovery coming on or something's happening. And people, who are, asset-based, truckers, all of a sudden they think, well, heck, we're going to go out and buy 15 trucks because obviously, the market's shifting, when, they're cattle haulers, or, there's something, again, not related to what the data itself is showing, because it can, turn real ugly if you're looking at the wrong stuff.
No, I would agree. And one thing, actually, we just submitted an article looking at this, where we actually looked at new truck orders, especially because we saw, the incredible surge in 2017 and 2018. And the one thing that we actually sort of concluded from this was carriers tend to get overly optimistic, especially the smaller carriers. And we saw evidence of this, that even in the start of 2019, when it was obvious that market conditions were going to be nowhere near where they were in 2018. Mm-hmm. You still had a lot of carriers wanting to add capacity. And we already had seen tremendous capacity get added. I think part of this is there's been this persistent belief that there is this shortage of truck drivers, even though there is, at an aggregate level, and I'm going to again say this, aggregate level, there is no evidence that there is a shortage of truck drivers. Now, is there a shortage of good truck drivers? Absolutely. Is there a shortage of good professors? Absolutely. Is there a shortage of good baseball players? Absolutely. There's always a shortage of good people, but there's not a shortage of people. And so that's one thing to keep in mind.
Well, this is an argument that happens quite a bit, right? Which is, does capacity ever really flee the market, right? Is there really an oversupply of capacity? I mean, those questions I think come up often, and especially, people in positions to buy trucks, to, grow fleets. I think you put it, really well, which is, the quality of qualitative and quantify it is a whole different argument, right? If you want to invest in trucks, there's probably plentiful drivers, but how does that impact your business? Are these good drivers? Will it help you grow profitably? Those are whole other discussions.
No, exactly. And, the other thing I always say is, if you're a small carrier, you have to recognize, if you've got 10 power units and you want to grow to 20, that starts requiring maybe a different administrative structure. The routing challenge of making sure I've got a balanced freight network for 20 power units is exponentially more complex than 10. Right. Same way 40 is exponentially more complex than 20. And so one thing to recognize is that being in a niche is not necessarily a bad thing. I think there's always this desire to grow, because it's the American way, right? You grow your business. We always talk about growth. My emphasis is always profit, because you can grow very unprofitably. We actually have done some research finding the most efficient carriers, the ones that are maximizing miles per power unit, if they get bigger, they actually start seeing that productivity go down.
Right.
So just always keep that in mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I talk to a lot of work with a lot of small, mid-sized carriers as well as brokers, and that's one of the biggest things, right? Which is, you absolutely can grow, but when it comes to economies of scale and how to operate businesses, especially for those who are small operators, who maybe started off as driving their own truck, and now they have 20 trucks. Operating a fleet of 20 trucks, like you said, is much different than operating a truck, even sometimes of 30 or 35 trucks. There are exponentially different models, or the profitability piece of it, how you get ROI on assets is a completely different model, again, from 20 trucks to 40 trucks, 100 trucks, whatever it may be. Sure, you think you can buy trucks and seat those drivers, but all the important pieces of making that business profitable, finding the right truck or the right load at the right price at the right time, those again increase exponentially the more trucks you have. And I think that's oftentimes what happens in our industry. Great people want to build their businesses, but without the skill set, right? Without the appropriate knowledge on how to do that in a scalable and sustainable way, we get lost, right? And so again, we see this continued cycle of capacity or new trucks entries, and then they leave. Capacity, leave. Again, it happens all the time.
Yeah, no, I mean it's the same way. I mean, in the maritime industry we call it shipping cycles,
Mm-hmm.
and there's great maritime economics books that have said, look, we'll go back to the 1700s. We can trace 20 shipping cycles. If we had the data, we've got a lot of data on trucking. You can see the same thing. I mean, we had a huge buildup of capacity right before the Great Recession. We saw almost 25% of capacity get eliminated, I believe, looking at the statistics.
Mm-hmm.
We build it back up. It took till 2014 to get back to 2007 employment in trucking. So,
Right.
I mean, we almost had a lost decade. And just like you said, I mean, we overshot capacity in 2018, which is why 2019 was a very rough year for the industry.
Right. Yeah. Some lessons are hard to learn, right? When,
Yeah.
from a tactical perspective, there's a lot of things that drive decisions. Often we talk about, what are lead measures versus what are lag measures. What are some of the lead things that you look at in order to make decisions off of? From a tactical perspective, as you look at some of the indexes and what they're doing, where volumes are coming from, kind of where they're going to, how do you recommend, especially those in kind of working within the finance of the business, to look at this in order to make tactical daily decisions?
So I think the one thing, the one challenge is, again, is what really is leading. And so I think the one thing always keep in mind is trucking is highly seasonal.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had a lot of discussion about this recently on LinkedIn. Is, for example, folks have seen the spot prices in June go up. And I've seen some people say, well, this is a sign of recovery. And I sit here and say, spot prices always go up in June. That is,
Right.
I mean, that's as regular as Christmas. June is always the best month for the spot market. So you got to think first seasonality.
Mm-hmm.
Is if you're in this sector, you're trying to understand leading, lagging, recognize that you can't compare May to June if you're talking spot prices. There's
Right.
going to be a seasonal component to that is baked in. So that's one thing. I think getting high frequency data is always a challenge. To me, one of the favorite sectors, I think if you're in trucking, and especially if you're a trucking company that hauls for industrial shippers, is watch the railroads.
Mm-hmm.
Because the railroads move, and not the intermodal container stuff, because again, that's going to be a lot more retail centric and very much import export centric.
Right.
But watch the data on, for example, the Association of American Railroads provides data on carloads, less, coal and grain. Or one of my favorites is actually the carloads of metallic ores and minerals. And the reason for that is, metallic ores and metals. And the reason for that is, if you're going to be make any type of durable good, you need steel.
Mm-hmm.
And most steel, the line haul movement is going to be by rail rather than truck, because I don't want to be moving a steel coil 1,000 miles by a truck. That's not very
Right.
cost efficient. And so, as an example, one thing that I've been looking at closely, trying to understand the industrial side of the recovery, is are we seeing movements of metallic ores and metals pick up for the U.S. railroads? And we can get this data every week for free from the Association of American Railroads. And as this chart is showing, this is not looking good from an industrial side.
Mm-hmm.
We are still essentially hovering around the bottom, and we're about, 30 some percent off of where we were from 2019. And when you start then taking a look and saying, okay, how far down is industrial production? Industrial production's been down about 15-16% year over year. You start thinking to yourself, okay, well, this is pretty indicative of that, because a lot of industrial production is going to involve at some point or another steel being used. Now, the one caveat I will say is that the inventories data that we have from the Census Bureau, now unfortunately there's a 2-month lag for that, so we only know till April. But we saw in retail, wholesale, and manufacturing some of the highest inventory levels we've ever seen due to the shutdowns. So there is going to be some time period where we're going to have to see manufacturers burn through those raw materials. We're going to have to see wholesalers, pushing out their inventories.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, this is one of those, statistics that's free and available, that when I start looking at industrial recovery, I start to get a little concerned. And unfortunately, I'd say unfortunately from a standpoint of what I think it bodes for the economy, but I think it matches with the inference we're making, is if you even look right now, we're starting to get all of these regional Federal Reserve manufacturing indices coming out. And we'll see ISM's index for June come out in July. But we're seeing, even though we're seeing shipments rebound, we're seeing new orders rebound, we're not really seeing employment coming back as much. And so that, from at least, again, and I guess I'm being in Michigan, I still have this strong industrial focus as I think about the economy. I worry when I'm not seeing, given the massive number of jobs we saw shed in manufacturing, we're not seeing a lot of manufacturers rushing to hire people back at the moment.
Right.
And so that's showing up as an example in some of the June data from the Federal Reserve banks.
Right.
And so that, to me, is where I'm a little concerned, again, from this overall job picture standpoint, is are we looking in the manufacturing sector at practically another jobless recovery like we saw coming out of the Great Recession?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a problem for sure. What do you think? So how should we prepare when it comes to, contract pricing versus spot pricing? How should that look as things start to turn, or if they turn? What's your view about that?
So, well, right now we've seen both Cass and Bureau of Labor Statistics, their data through May has shown contract prices have plummeted. They're down about 5% year over year.
Yeah.
My statement would be is that seems a little too extreme. Because we've seen a lot of capacity leave the industry too. I mean, Bureau of Labor Statistics is showing that overall we've had about a 6% decline in employment. My statement would be is, as a shipper, if you are going in now and, for example, doing a mini bid, we're seeing a lot more, are these 3-month contract prices. And my impression is that a lot of shippers are trying to lock in really low rates, contract rates, while carriers are struggling.
Right.
I'm not sure that is the best strategy. I could understand doing a 3-month mini bid if you're just so uncertain about what things are going to be. But my statement would be a little cautious on that, because if we don't see that capacity return, always remember that it doesn't take much of a spike of overall volumes above capacity to turn the spot market red hot.
Right.
A good example of that was 2017 with Hurricanes Harvey and Maria. If
Yeah.
you take a look at what caused that September spike that then continued the rest of the year, it was those hurricane recovery efforts.
Yeah.
So I think from a standpoint as a shipper, I'd be concerned about going in too aggressively right now and trying to command contract price reductions.
Mm-hmm.
I could understand it when there was some aggressive focus in 2019 because probably the 10% increases we saw in 2018 were not really realistic because this is a cost plus business, right?
Mm-hmm.
And carriers' costs didn't go up 10% on line haul rates. That didn't happen. So they were definitely padding the margins a little bit.
Right.
But don't be too aggressive. The last thing you want is for your carriers to be failing and you're having to go deeper in your routing guide or you're having to go on the spot market because you know chances are you're going to pay more and now your budget is completely useless.
Yeah.
So my statement to shippers is treat your carriers well. Good carriers is good for you in the long run. It may not feel that way if you're paying an extra 3 cents more per mile, but in the long run, it does pay off because half the time spot rates, when you really break down the data that we see for large shippers, usually spot rates are about 50% more, if not higher, than what your contract rate was.
Right. Yeah. I know a lot of carriers would argue that, hey, you know, the 10% increase in rates in 2018 was basically, you know, a lot of pent up demand from, you know, years previous of really low contractual rate increases that had been, you know, part of the industry. So I think, but I do think, you know, it needs to be progressive, right? 2018, we saw the, you know, we saw the moonshot with, you know, so much of the pricing that happened and became, again, unsustainable. 2019, what happens? It plummets again. I'm a huge advocate for carriers getting, obviously, you know, the money necessary to cover the cost and obviously make a profit. But again, that relationship between the shipper and the carrier to make sure that it's a cohesive working model that's both sustainable to both parties is, you know, hugely important. But it becomes so adversarial at sometimes in markets like this where we see, you know, 2018, 2019, 2020, and then what's going to happen on the outside of it. I mean, it just happens again. It's a cycle that's hard to break.
No, it is, and I think part of it too, and the challenge is my experience with a lot of shippers is they approach truckload procurement identical to how they approach component procurement.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's always this idea: if I give you more business, you should give me a lower price.
Right.
And that makes sense if there's economies of scale. But in truckload, it's all about economies of scope, right? It's going from A to B and then B to C and C to D and back to A without having to deadhead equipment and without having to wait a long time. And I find a lot of shippers don't even understand that the price I'm giving you this year is predicated on what my freight network looks like.
Mm-hmm.
If I lose a big customer going into next year, let's say now before I have balance out of your facility, now I'm very imbalanced. I have to raise my price because I now have to deadhead or I'm going to have to wait longer to get a load. And so I think one thing that we have to keep doing in this industry, and I think we're getting better with our interactions with shippers, is explaining the underlying economics of the truckload sector because it's very different from the economics of component procurement. And so I think that's just something that we have to keep in mind of saying, yes, it makes sense maybe if demand is way down that you can command your supplier cut their prices by 5% because they just want to keep their facility open. But that doesn't work in trucking.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, we could speak for probably another 3 hours on what happens, you know, every time, you know, a network bid comes out and everything becomes optimized again, which throws out of sync everything that both the carrier and a lot of times the shippers will have worked on over the last year, 2 years, whatever it may be. You know, the sunk cost or the hidden cost in making those changes is exponentially, I think, undervalued. And it hurts ultimately both parties, you know, especially with so much talk from the, you know, the shipper side saying, hey, we value consistency and service, but at the same time, you know, costs become kind of the underlying decision for most of their decisions. Same happens sometimes on the carrier side as well. You know, they want to get, you know, a higher paying load. Maybe it's outside of the network a little bit, but they'll make, you know, small changes in order to accommodate that better paying freight. when the reality is that that cost that's associated with making that change, again, is sometimes hidden to the overall kind of scope of what they're doing. But that's a huge, I think, and I do think it's getting better for sure as more transparency happens, as more technology is available to help both the shipper and the carrier make really informed decisions regarding kind of network viability and profitability.
No, I agree. I think one example of a shipper I've worked with that I thought they had one of the best mentality approaches to this is they do their annual bid every year. But for a certain set of core carriers, what they basically say to them is offline, here's what we're looking at. And basically
Mm-hmm.
they'll do and this is a very small set of large firms, they'll do a one-on-one negotiation. They'll, in some cases, say same price as last year or bump it up 3%. They'll lock them in the exact same network configuration, and then they bid out the rest of it, taking out that freight with the logic of we want to make sure that core group is well served because they've been doing a good job for us. And what I've seen a shipper like that do was one carrier one time, it had had a very poor year the year before, and they told them, you get your performance up this next year or we're not doing this one-on-one. You're going back in the
Yeah.
optimized pool.
Yeah, I know Home Depot is one of them, for example, which I really like the model. Is performance is tied to availability or invitation to the bids, right? So as your performance improves, you get access to a wider range of available freight, and so I like that approach to tie performance to then ultimately what should become profit for that particular carrier. I like that, and then everything else is, like you said, is a bit outside of that. But it really ties carriers into performance and really taking not only advantage of the opportunity they have with the shipper, but really get their teams motivated to, hey, we got a big opportunity here to improve our business. We got to perform.
No, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, good, man. Well, we're coming up on time here, but I really appreciate this discussion. You've done a great job, I think, articulating not only kind of the metrics and what's important to both truckload and intermodal and to our freight industry as a whole. But what I really like about your approach is that I think it's easy to digest. Folks who, again, aren't in it in the numbers every single day, who aren't economists or whatever it may be, it's understandable in a relative way, I think, to doing business. And it helps people make, hopefully strategical decisions as well as tactical decisions. It's important, I think, to note that, like you said, no data is perfect. You have to, have multiple inputs in order to make the right decision. But I think you outline a super great argument for looking at, really what matters, the data around it, and then hopefully, using that data to make, again, better decisions for your business in the future. So I appreciate it. Thanks for your time very much. How can we get a hold of you if someone wants to interact with you or have questions to you? What's the best way to contact you?
So either hit me up on LinkedIn, that works well, or other thing, honestly, throw my name with Michigan State behind it in Google. It'll bring you to my department webpage, which has my email. So just send me an email.
Awesome. Good deal. All right, Jason. Well, thanks for your time very much.
Hey, thanks for having me.